So when you look at my family history, I come from a lineage of green thumbs, and so you'd never think that I would become a scientist. But to my dad's displeasure, I seldom care whether a tree lives or dies. And so this is important to him because he's spent his life doing such things as in 1970 sculpting the grounds around the St. Louis Arch and hand choosing these trees around the arch site. And unfortunately for my dad, one of the things that has saddened him lately is that these trees have all been replaced because these ash trees have succumbed to emerald ash borer. But the tree that has really captivated me is my own family tree, which rather than having an emerald ash borer, we're riddled with diabetes. And so as a child, I stood witness to a number of different things, such as debilitating neuropathies, non-healing wounds, the obesity-related cancers that have struck many of my loved ones. And so those things, those shortcomings in modern medicine, have fueled my desires to try to change the future of diabetes care. And so while I realize that I can't do anything to treat my mother's diabetes and cure that, my goal has been to improve the future of healthcare for these beautiful young children and the next generation. And since I was the age of these beautiful young nieces of mine, I've had wonderful teachers that have really inspired me and nurtured my passionate disdain for diabetes. Ultimately, some of my greatest teachers are lab animals that we've engineered. And so I see people going, oh my God, how fat is that mouse? Frieda was the fattest mouse in the history of the world. And though she's 4 times wider than she is tall, the remarkable thing about Frieda is she's metabolically healthy. Her blood glucose is normal, her lipid levels are normal. Frieda is, as Trevor would call her, fat and happy. But Frieda teaches us a remarkable thing, that adipose tissue per se is not necessarily a bad thing metabolically. And so the lesson that Frieda teaches us is a lesson that many of my mentors and I share believe in, is that what is really driving diabetes is the improper placement of lipid into locales where it should not be. And so when this is a term called lipotoxicity. And so I was originally introduced by this term lipotoxicity by my PhD mentor, Scott Summers. And lipotoxicity refers to the cellular dysfunction or death as induced by too much lipid in that cell. This was a term that was originally coined by my friend and colleague Roger Unger at UT Southwestern. And for my last 3 years at UT Southwestern, I ran my lab jointly with my friend and colleague Roger Unger, who's my academic hero. So I did my PhD here, and when I left a decade ago, I went on to Philip Scher's lab at UT Southwestern, where I was indoctrinated into the belief that the adipose tissue is the center of metabolic health. And what is meant by that is that when I eat too much for dinner tonight, if I can store that excess calorie into a lipid droplet, that is incredibly protective of other tissues such as the liver, as these lipids can spill over into tissues that are not suitable for lipid storage. Additionally, as we learned in Claudio's video, there are all kinds of different fat cells, and a lot of these are incredibly proficient at burning energy, burning these lipids to create heat or to produce ATP. And if we don't store those lipids or burn them, then a lot of these lipids become toxic metabolites that can impair insulin action or require more insulin for a diabetic to maintain their normal blood glucose. That's insulin resistance. So after 10 years at UT Southwestern, I returned back home here to Utah so I could join up with Scott Summers. So Scott Summers is like a brother to me. And when I was a PhD student with Scott, we were able to identify this pathway and this particular metabolite, ceramide, as the real critical lipid that accumulates to cause lipotoxicity and to cause lipid-induced insulin resistance. And so what's important about that is that we identified this pathway as a set of targets that we can use to treat diabetes and improve insulin sensitivity. And so highlighted in red, you see two of these targets that we believe are the most tractable targets for the future treatment of diabetes by improving insulin sensitivity in adult diabetics. So one of the alternative ways of lowering sphingolipids is by driving their catabolism, driving their breakdown. And so while I was a postdoc with Phil Scher, one of the seminal observations that we made is that we can drive the breakdown of ceramides with the adipose-derived hormone, adiponectin. So one of the things that Phil was famous for is introducing that the adipocyte is also an endocrine hormone. It produces hormones like leptin and adiponectin, and these are potently anti-lipotoxic hormones. And so by cleaving ceramides, adiponectin is very potently protective of a cell and very potently insulin sensitizing. And so we were able to capitalize on this seminal observation. And this led to my first independent grant, a K99 ROO from the NIH, an additional R01 from the NIH, and an additional Career Development Award from the JDRF to evaluate this mechanism in different tissues to try to protect the body against diabetes. So using these ceramidase enzymes as a tool to try to lower ceramides in different locales, we have been able to identify a cell type that we never really thought about as being subject to lipotoxicity. And so with my buddy Roger Unger, we began to hypothesize that ceramides could build up in the alpha cell. So what is an alpha cell? Where are we looking? So this is in the pancreas, you have two incredibly important cell types that regulate glucose homeostasis. You have your insulin-producing beta cells, which produce insulin to lower blood glucose, and you have your glucagon-producing alpha cells that produce glucagon, which increases glucose production from the liver, particularly during times of fasting to keep our brain fed. What's underappreciated in diabetes is that glucagon is elevated in virtually every form of diabetes. And so what that does is this keeps the liver stuck in a constant upregulated state of glucose production. It turns the liver into a glucose-producing organ that's never shut off. And so what we've been able to find is that these ceramides in the alpha cell actually do accumulate, and these ceramides in the alpha cell have profound effects at driving this glucagon production and driving whole body glucose homeostasis. So one of the interesting side effects that we noticed in the course of this is that whenever you block glucagon action, you get a side effect in the pancreas. And so I show you here this side effect. This is an alpha cell hyperplasia. So those glucagon-producing alpha cells hyperproliferate because the body senses we're not making enough glucagon. But what's interesting is when you stop such a treatment, when you normalize glucagon signaling, these alpha cells disappear. Where do they go? What do they become? And what's amazing is when we do this in the context of type 1 diabetes, this gives us a clue to where these become. In a type 1 diabetes, if you block glucagon action, rather than making new alpha cells, you start making new beta cells. And so the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation eats this up because this is actually a potential way to cure type 1 diabetes. You're generating new beta cells from a previously non-considered source of these beta cells production. And every type 1 diabetic has these alpha cells in a plentiful amount that we can harness to try to make new beta cells. So none of this means anything unless we can translate this into the clinic. So can Scott and I use some of these new drugs that his company has found to try to lower ceramides to treat diabetes? Can we produce adiponectin mimetics to try to drive that ceramide cleavage? Can we block glucagon action to try to produce this new source of beta cells? And can we use these to achieve a clinical impact in the clinic for these future generations? So my newest driving source of inspiration, my 4-month-old son, Duke, my goal is to make it so that when Duke is 72 years old, he's present for his family photo.